Hi, for those of you who just joined us, we're gonna start in a few moments while people start trickling in into the attendees list, and then we'll get this conversation going. Thank you. Wonderful. Okay. Well, without further ado, I think we'll get this going. And so, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining today's conversation. A new Soviet Union: what Russia's invasion of Ukraine means for the freedom of the near abroad. And on behalf of the National Security Institute at George Mason University, Antonin Scalia Law School, I'm Gabriel Otis. And we're thrilled to be hosting Rose Gottemoeller, the former Deputy Secretary General of NATO, to examine the implications of the invasion of Ukraine on Russia's policy towards the near abroad, and how these former Soviet nations are working to preserve their freedoms in the face of Russian aggression. And with that, though, I would like to start by introducing the moderator for today's panel. Jenny Cafarella is an NSI Fellow and Director of Strategic Initiatives and National Security Fellow at the Institute for the Study of War, where she regularly advises senior military leaders as well as policymakers on the threat the U.S. and our allies are facing. ISW, of course, has been doing amazing work filling in and keeping folks informed about what's currently happening in and during the war in Ukraine. And so we would like to thank her and her team for that. Jenny is affiliated in addition to the National Security Institute with other numerous institutions, including fellowships at the International Center for the Study of Radicalization at King's College London, and has recently been selected for the Middle East Policy Council's 40 Under 40. So welcome, Jenny. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the kind introduction and to the shout out to the ISW team. I'm incredibly proud of them, and they're putting forward that Ukraine work even as we speak. So it's my privilege to work with them. It's also my privilege to host this discussion today. Rose, I don't think really needs further introduction, but I will simply add to what has already been introduced to say that she's currently with Stanford University, which is of course incredible. And before that, as was mentioned, she served as Deputy Secretary General of NATO from 2016 to 19, where she helped drive forward NATO's adaptation to new security challenges in Europe and the fight against terrorism. I don't think we'll have much time for a Middle East related discussion today, and that's a bit of a shame. We'll have to consider follow-up events, because I know, Rose, that you surely have expertise to lend on that complicated situation as well. But prior
Thank you, Jenny.
Yeah.
Actually, I do have something I want to say on the Middle East, so maybe we'll get a hook in there.
Oh, that would be excellent. That would be excellent. And the only other bio piece I wanted to make sure to introduce is that you, of course, also served as the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security at the Department of State. And I am sure that we will be addressing some non-proliferation and related issues today. So thank you again.
Very good. Very good. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I too want to give a shout out to your team from the Study of War Institute, because their stuff has been fantastic during this terrible war of aggression by Russia against Ukraine. It's been really, really helpful to have. So big shout out to them from me too.
Thank you. We really appreciate it. Excellent. So I'd like to kick us off with a framing question. This event title today included the concept of a, quote, new Soviet Union. And so I wanted to open the discussion by asking you what you think about that concept, and is it the best way for us to frame Putin's ambitions as they relate to Ukraine, but also, his wider goals?
Yep, absolutely. And just truth in advertising to our audience, I was teasing Jenny and the other organizers about using that title, because I said, I don't think what's happening has anything to do with recreating the Soviet Union. Putin clearly wants to try to recreate some Slavic heartland involving Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. And he has in mind repeating a kind of imperial historical experience from that perspective. But I do not see him turning his attention to Central Asia, for example, and trying to restore the Soviet and Russian empire in that area. I think it's just too big of a piece for him to bite off. And now, with the profound difficulties Russia is running into in its war of aggression against Ukraine, I think that that's even receding farther into the distance. What is more, it's fascinating to me. I'd be interested if any of our audience have been carefully studying the Central Asia situation, but it's been surprising to me the amount of kind of independence and seeking other contacts that the Central Asian leaders have been undertaking. The president of Kazakhstan, Tokayev, for example, welcoming Russians fleeing the draft. A lot of young Russian men have set up a business or are operating in their working lives out of Kazakhstan. That surprised me quite a bit, but Tokayev also, in hosting the SCO Summit, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit last November, he was very clear, talking very straightforwardly about the necessity of avoiding nuclear use in Ukraine. And that was the famous summit at which Xi Jinping, the president of China, and also Narendra Modi, the PM of India, spoke very clearly and publicly reproving Putin, which was to me unprecedented in public that they would do such a thing, but reproving him for his nuclear threats against Ukraine. So I do think that, it's an interesting balancing act that's going on with the Central Asians. And I think it's something that deserves a lot of study, but I don't think we're about recreating the Soviet Union with this war of aggression in Ukraine.
Thank you. And I'll mention that for those that are in the audience, we will be taking questions. So please do feel free to start populating those via the question and answer feature. I will keep my eye on it, and we do intend to preserve time at the end of this for those. So we look forward to your questions. In the meantime, I'll ask a quick follow-up on that, on the Central Asian theme, which is, to what degree, Rose, do you think that the outcome thus far of Russia's bid in Ukraine is causing a recalibration in Central Asia? Is that the primary factor here, or was Putin's influence perhaps already overstated in that region going into the war?
I think it's, as I've read it, and again, I haven't made the kind of study of it I would like to, so I welcome experts in our audience commenting on this. But as I see it, I think it was a sharp wake-up call for leaders throughout Central Asia, and they started recalibrating what phone they needed to pick up first if they were running into trouble. And I also will include the South Caucasus in that, with Armenia and Azerbaijan recently, and all the processes there of negotiation that are going on. Normally, they would be very dependent on Moscow in those kinds of negotiations. But I know the European Union has been playing a role, the United States has been playing a role, and I don't sense that Baku and Yerevan are immediately picking up the phone now, with Moscow as the first port of call. It's the same, I believe, in Central Asia, with a lot more attention to opening up lines of communication with China, and perhaps also with India. Again, I'd like to know more about what other experts are seeing, but it's a matter of Russia not being their first reference when it comes to their security, when it comes to their economic survivability, and when it comes to their political position in Eurasia. And that, to me, is a very important strategic shift that Putin's going to have to account for when the accounting comes. He's been, I think, so unsuccessful in his Ukraine gambit, but I think this shift in strategic view in Central Asia is also a part of his negative legacy.
Certainly. And I think another thing that became clear as he bungled this war of aggression in Ukraine is that there are many folks that actually had looked at the Russia threat and perhaps, or Russia's capacities, and perhaps overestimated what Russia was capable of. And that's true with some of the reported intelligence assessments, right, going into the war, for how well the Russians were going to perform. But if we zoom out, as you have done, there were a lot of concessions made, for example, in the Middle East, in my experience, where the concept of Russia's ability to project power, I think in retrospect, is now kind of put into question by the realities that we're seeing in Ukraine. And so I think that recalibration is perhaps overdue.
Yes, and it's very interesting because I think our experience of the Russian armed forces over the past decade has very much been based on the fight in Syria and the fight that the Russians have undertaken to prop up the Assad government in Syria. And we've seen the performance of Russian new missile systems in Syria. We've seen the success of their longer range missiles. They were even at times launching some of their longer range missiles from like the caliber from the Caspian Sea and attacking targets in Syria. And so it was meant to show off a lot of their new technological capability and capacity. And indeed, they were very successful at reestablishing their historical bridgeheads in Syria, their listening posts, their naval bases, etc., their operating bases. So I think there, in some settings, there was a sense of surprise that actually they are not doing very well in a big ground war in Ukraine. And it comes down to, I think, again, there are a number of factors involved, but the amount of corruption that has existed as the Russian armed forces have modernized, and that in fact they haven't really built up the requisite stocks to carry out a long and grinding ground war. And that goes for ammunition, that goes for personnel equipment, things like uniforms and boots, winter equipment. We saw problems with that last year, and foodstuffs to feed the hungry army and when they're on the march. All of these things have been gravely affected by the corruption in the Russian system. And so juxtaposing their successful experience, at least quote unquote successful, in propping up Bashar al-Assad versus the failures we've seen in Ukraine, I think, frankly, that's an interesting area for study. Could I just mention one more thing that's just struck me this morning about Syria? Again, I'd be very interested in your reaction and reactions from the audience.
Sure, of course.
Russia and NATO both have been cautious about coming into direct contact in this war, although there are some troubling developments, I think, in the Black Sea we might discuss a bit more. But what has interested me is seeing that they are racking up interference against U.S. Reaper drones in Syria. Just over the last couple of weeks in July, they have been going after Reaper drones time and time again, shooting flares, trying to damage them in flight, even flying their own aircraft dangerously close to the Reapers as they're operating over Syria. So I'm wondering if there's not a bit of a proxy thing going on here. Well, we can't go after you in the Black Sea or in Ukraine in the way we'd like to, but boy, are we going to extract a price for you in your operations over Syria. I don't know, Jennifer, what do you think about that?
No, I would agree. And I'm equally concerned. It does seem that we are watching the Russians increase their escalation tolerance inside of Syria. Not that any of this behavior is inherently unprecedented in Syria. They've done this kind of unsafe harassment, but we are seeing an uptick in the scale and the extent to which this is, has been repeated incidents in a relatively short period of time. So
Exactly.
I am concerned that
I was really surprised to see the list. Just in July, there are like 9 incidents or something like that. That's really, really very concerning.
Absolutely. And we're seeing increased indications actually that the Russians are coordinating directly on the ground with Iran, Iran's proxies and the Assad regime, potentially for an escalation against U.S. ground forces that are operating with the Syrian Democratic Forces east of the Euphrates River. So I think there's a real risk of escalation here. And that as Putin's war effort in Ukraine continues to bog down, and as hopefully the Ukrainians continue to gain momentum, I do think these risks of lateral escalation in other theaters will continue to increase. And we perhaps may already be seeing the opening stages of that in Syria.
It's very important to keep a sharp eye on, because also Iran at this point is feeling its oats and very keen to up its support to Hezbollah and to its other proxies in the area. So this is really interesting. I have to tell you honestly, I've just kind of wakened up to it as I've been preparing for this meeting today.
Yeah, it's definitely unfolding, and perhaps we can have a future discussion on that particular threat, because I do think it's worth further exploration. And of course, the situation in Syria is highly complicated, but also relevant to NATO, given that Turkey's role in Syria remains, one of those quirks in the Syrian conflict that makes it difficult for the United States to engage. So I will be sure to pivot us back to the topic at hand so that I don't indulge too much in a Syria conversation that I would love But as we're talking about the perceptions of the Russian threat, the ones that we had going into the war, the ones in Central Asia, and perhaps how some of that threat was, overstated, or some of the capacity wasn't quite there in the way that we expected. The other perception of Russia that I think we should mention coming into this is actually the perception in Eastern Europe of the threat that Putin posed to, Ukraine, and the threat that Putin, I think, desires to pose to states like the Baltics. So I'd love to ask you for your perspective on that, and how that threat perception changed perhaps during the first Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014, and then now after, the big invasion began last year.
Right. Well, frankly, I think NATO has done an excellent job, with some caveats, which I'll come back to. But 2014 and the invasion of Crimea was a huge wake-up call for NATO, and resulted in, first of all, this pledge to put more money into defense spending. 2% of GDP to be spent on defense modernization was a big pledge at the Wales summit in 2014. NATO agreed to do it. Again, that's where there's a big caveat I'm going to come back to. But the other thing that started at that moment was the resolve in NATO to again pay more attention to the deterrence and defense of Europe, and really re-emphasize that necessity after 2 decades plus of focusing on counterterrorism and out-of-area operations. And so it was a big wake-up call. It launched that effort. Frankly, when I got to NATO in 2016, the Warsaw Summit had just taken place, and NATO had promised to put in place 4 battle groups in the Baltic states and in Poland. And I had a kind of view in my head at that time of NATO as a slow-moving organization. I learned my lesson while I was there. They can be very fast-moving when they need to. And by 1 year after I arrived, those battle groups were all certified, trained, and ready. And that was, to me, an amazing accomplishment. Now, the battle groups are small. People complain about that. There are 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 troops. But the point of them is that they are made up of units from all across NATO. So Russia can be in no doubt, if it attacks the Baltic states or Poland, it is attacking all of NATO. And that, of course, is a trigger for an Article 5 decision by NATO to come to the aid of an ally. So I thought that was a very important move, and it's only continued since. It has continued up through the invasion in February of 22, and now really been strongly reiterated. And with new defense plans being put in place at the Vilnius summit a couple of weeks ago, NATO is fully now reinvested in the deterrence and defense mission in Europe. And I think that is a really strong and important and necessary set of decisions that NATO has made and now is implementing. Where I have my caveat is again on defense spending, because 2% of GDP was the promise in 2014. Now, almost 10 years later, NATO countries are still lagging. February of 2 things put a fire under them. One thing was Donald Trump in his presidency. He was unrelenting in pushing for allies to step up to this target. And I think, frankly, Jens Stoltenberg, my boss at the time, still the Secretary General of NATO, and I both felt that that was very important pressure that President Trump was exerting at the time. But now the war in Ukraine has really lit a fire under NATO allies such as Germany, who had not been really willing to step up to the 2% bar. And so I do think that the move is strongly in the right direction now on defense spending in NATO.
Excellent. And how confident are you at this point that NATO will be able to sustain the unity necessary to see Ukraine through this war?
I have never seen NATO so gathered around a single objective and a single purpose as they are today. And this, it operates by consensus decision making, and it's been clear in recent years that there have been a lot of quarrels inside NATO over various aspects. I'll just cite the unwillingness of the Hungarians, for example, to have Ukraine attend a Ukraine NATO Commission meeting through the years while I was at NATO, because of their concerns about the treatment of Hungarian minorities in Ukraine. Now, that has all dissipated in this current war. I know there's still behind the scenes, no doubt, some difficult discussions going on. But nevertheless, we now have this new NATO-Ukraine Council that just met this week on Wednesday. We have the ability of the Ukrainian leadership to consult and work closely with NATO at every turn and at every level. military and civilian. So I think that this is really an important evolution of the alliance, and shows how closely now NATO is intertwined with Ukraine, and with Ukraine on the path to eventual NATO membership. We can talk about what that means. It's going to take some time, but I do think that there is that essential intertwining taking place now. And it's not only with NATO, it's with the European Union as well. The other major strategic shift in this war has been that Ukraine is clearly now on a path to joining the rest of Europe in terms of both economic ties, political ties through the European Union, and also military and security ties through NATO. And again, that is an enormous strategic shift, which wasn't necessarily, a consensus of the Ukrainian population before this war started. But that's another one of Putin's big mistakes. He's cemented the resolve of the Ukrainian population now to be moving toward Europe.
In fact, I'm not sure he could have picked a more disastrous outcome for his initial aims in this war than to galvanize NATO and to cohere it behind Ukraine, and also to cohere Ukraine behind its own sense of sovereignty and desire to be part of Europe.
Exactly.
So I'd love to ask you a follow-up question on this consensus point, because I think there are sometimes criticisms leveled against NATO and the coalition supporting Ukraine that, while we've achieved unity on some of the military support necessary for Ukraine, that perhaps the question of the long-term outcome of the war and Ukraine's ultimate inclusion into NATO is still not a point of consensus, despite some of the hopes that folks had going into the most recent NATO summit. So I'd love to see your perspective on whether you think that is going to be achievable for Ukraine, or if there are still some serious diplomatic obstacles that would need to be overcome in order for Ukraine to end up in NATO.
Well, I'll be honest with you. I do think, as I mentioned a moment ago, that its move toward the European Union is a very important phase and an important step that will smooth the way toward NATO membership. This is not official NATO policy or EU policy. This is my own personal view of the matter. But I do think if it is, moving toward the European Union and it's interesting, historically, it was always NATO first and then the European Union. But I think in this case, it would help if Ukraine is moving rapidly and smoothly into European Union membership, which will take some heavy lifting in Kyiv to bring them up to EU standards on a number of points. But nevertheless, that process does seem well entrained now. And the other point that I like to really emphasize is that after 2014, this essential intertwining took place also very much at the uniform military level, with NATO countries, particularly countries such as Canada, who have a lot of Ukrainian, Canadian, in their population. They started training the Ukrainian armed forces in a way that has made them essentially interoperable with NATO armed forces. And this always is a very, very important consideration when countries are preparing to join the alliance. That's why there's been such a smooth path for Sweden and Finland, because they, for many, many years, had already been close partners operating together with NATO on things like Baltic air policing. So they had a very smooth path to NATO membership, in part because they were so interoperable with the NATO armed forces. And now many countries in NATO are saying not only are they interoperable, but they are also battle hardened, which is unlike a number of the NATO armies who have not experienced combat for a long, long time. So I see many net benefits for NATO in Ukraine coming into the alliance. But I also want to say that people shrug and say, well, then why not do it right now? There are still a lot of issues that Ukraine will have to address. There were remarks, again, about corruption. There were remarks about civilian control of the military at the Vilnius summit. One thing people don't often think about is the necessity of the links between the Ukrainian security services and the Russian security services being completely broken for this to go forward, because in NATO depends on the security clearances that each of its NATO member states can offer up to the people working at NATO, to Ukrainian, staff members or military men working at NATO. And if NATO cannot depend on the Ukrainian security service preventing people from just sending stuff straight to the FSB in Moscow, they're not going to be ready to move forward. So there are a lot of what I call those pragmatic bread and butter, but very important issues that will have to be resolved. Again, watching from the outside, I can see a huge amount of progress being made in cutting those ties between the FSB and the Ukrainian security services, the GRU, military intelligence, and their Ukrainian counterparts out of necessity and really for their own interest in defending themselves. But there will have to be some considerable work, I think, in those areas as well.
Sure, and I think that's an important distinction too between the principle of, what should occur both for Ukraine, but also for NATO's benefit, versus the practicalities of how we get there. I do think some folks are getting a little dismayed that, we're not achieving the principle right away. But it's not the case that there's not progress, right? And it's not the case that there's not intent to overcome some of these pragmatic issues, including on Ukraine's side, which I know, is a huge
Absolutely.
focus. So that's the good
Absolutely.
news.
Yep. Absolutely. And again, I think the pragmatic progress that Ukraine has made since 2014 in terms of becoming interoperable with the NATO armed forces is vital and will be a very important consideration here.
Look, I think your point that Ukraine also has a lot of battle-hardened, experience and hard-fought lessons learned to offer NATO is important. So I'd also emphasize that one as well and say, part of what Ukraine is attempting in their current counteroffensive against entrenched Russian forces is an extraordinary form of offensive warfare that, frankly, NATO would not really attempt to do without air power, without the ability to provide close air support on those front lines. So what Ukraine is attempting, should give us pause because it is brave on a level that, we would really, I think, struggle to match. And they're succeeding. They're not succeeding as fast as folks want, right? There's not a spectacular breakthrough, but progress is happening on the ground. They've launched a renewed push. And I think there will be a ton of benefit to NATO to understand how Ukraine did this, and hopefully how ultimately they will transition it into a major success on the battlefield.
Yes, that's a very fair point, how they're doing it without close air support and without air superiority behind Russian lines as well. And that's very important. The other just additional comment I'd make is how much we are all learning from the experience of new technology in this war in Ukraine. The use of drones obviously has been extraordinarily important, but also the use of satellite imagery from low Earth orbit, and then the use of satellites, as we know, for keeping the internet running and the communications links going. So there's a lot I think we're going to learn, and NATO's going to learn from Ukraine's war with Russia and from its eventual victory.
Excellent. Well, we have questions populating from the audience, but I'm going to ask you one last as the moderator's prerogative here before we turn, which is to ask you how you see this war ending. You've stated hopefully in Ukrainian victory. Do you think they can achieve a victory outright on the battlefield? And if so, how does the United States and NATO need to think about a post-Ukraine victory space and hopefully a post-Ukraine victory Russia?
Right. Well, those are questions that we could talk about all afternoon. So I will only say that I can see the objectives of the Ukrainian offensive, which are to really reacquire territory in a way that will make the Russians unable to continue, and whether they are able to reestablish the contact with the Sea of Azov and cut the land bridge that Russia has. I think that is a very important goal, the land bridge between its territories in eastern Ukraine, the ones that it has illegally seized, and the Crimean Peninsula, which it has illegally seized. Whether Ukraine can achieve that goal, it's still unknown, but I think they've got the right goal, and let's see how they are able to continue. I do believe if that basic, I will put it this way, that basic win for Russia of establishing that land bridge is undone, that may be a moment at which the Kremlin finally decides to sue for peace, and we need to be ready for that in terms of working with the Ukrainians. And I know there's a lot of thinking going on about how to carry that forward. The Ukrainians will continue to emphasize that they want to push Russian troops off of every centimeter of their territory. I think that's right to articulate that goal. But we'll see if something else is accomplished, like severing the land bridge, whether that is the moment at which Kyiv is ready to begin talking. And I agree with everything President Biden and his administration says about waiting for the Ukrainians to be ready to seize that moment and begin negotiations. It's really up to them. So we'll see. But that said, there's been a lot of good work out there on how to assure security for Ukraine. It has a lot to do with moving it toward NATO membership as well as EU membership, but also in the meantime, assuring its security by, again, intertwining it with a number of powerful countries that can help to provide for its reconstruction as well as for its continued development as a powerful military force. And I wanted to point for the audience again, it was little noticed, I thought, but the agreement that the G7 reached on the final days of the Vilnius summit was, I think, very, very important in underscoring that powerful countries around the world, not only in Europe, but also countries such as Japan, are ready to continually support the Ukrainians as they are developing their capability and capacity economically, politically, and in the military security realm, number one, but also then will be very closely tied in with Ukraine as it tries to rebuild after the war, supplying resources for rebuilding, but also making demands on Russia, of course, to atone for its sins by paying for some of this reconstruction that has to go on. So I think that that's important, that Ukraine has very strong and powerful friends that will continue to be working with it as we move forward. As to Russia, this is a call to all of us. Again, I'm very interested in what people say about what we need to be thinking about for Russia going forward. The last thing we want, as I've been thinking about it, is a Russia as this kind of paranoid pariah crouched between a Europe ready to defend itself and a China ready to embrace it, but as a weakling, and therefore take advantage of its weaknesses. Is that what we want for Russia in the coming years of decades of this century and into the next century? Or is there some way we can think about, again, over time, as it atones for its terrible aggression against Ukraine, repays or pays for the rebuilding, et cetera? But can we be starting now to think about what it would take to get Russia out of that paranoid crouch and back into some kind of relationship with Europe, with the United States, with the G7 as a whole? And I'm interested in what people on this call have to say.
Yeah, I like the way you frame that requirement, because I do think it's important, as you have done, to state up front that a just war for Ukraine is the precondition. Russia needs to atone for this war of aggression. But then also to, open the aperture for what is the kind of future, that Putin has essentially inflicted on his population. It's quite sad, actually, what is happening to Russia, the costs that he is leveraging on his own population for this war of choice, this war of aggression. And,
Right.
long term, my hope for Russia would be that they also can emerge, somehow from this, perhaps in decades hence, with a brighter future than the path they're currently on.
Yeah, and I think we're all reflecting quite a bit on the outcome of World War I versus World War II. And I've just been rereading Tony Judd's post-war, where he talks about how essentially, slowly but surely, there was work done to begin to reestablish Germany in Europe as a viable player. And that took a lot of heavy lifting and a long, long time. So it's not going to be easy, but I think we do need to start thinking about it now.
Yeah, and part of what makes that hard, and will lead me into some audience questions here, is that this kind of topic often gets hijacked by disinformation or information operations to say, well, therefore, we shouldn't let the Russians be defeated, or we should grant concessions now so that we don't alienate Russia. That's exactly.
We should give them off ramps. We need to give them off ramps.
It's not the case. Russia must be defeated in this war. But then we also must think about, what is the long-term prospect there? But I wanted to ask you about some of those perceptions of Putin and how Putin sees the world, because it gets so often talked about in the public discourse here in the US and in the West. And we have a few questions here from the audience that include, Do you think that Putin might perceive Ukrainian entrance into the EU as even more threatening than an entrance into NATO? That's one of the questions from the audience.
Well, it is interesting because that is what was the impetus, I believe, for the invasion of Crimea in 2014, that the Ukrainians were ready to sign the association agreement with the EU. And that seems to have lit a fire under Putin at that point. But I have to say, well, here's an interesting phenomenon that I'm still really trying to untangle myself. But throughout this war, it's been NATO, NATO, NATO. From the Kremlin, from Peskov, from the Russians, it's all NATO's fault. And NATO and the United States in NATO are impelling the Ukrainians to fight to the last drop of Ukrainian blood. And so NATO has been this kind of the big enemy force out there, which nevertheless they're not going to touch because they too are trying to avoid World War III. And so they have been deterred from taking on NATO in this war. I think also they just can't handle it militarily, and that's the brute truth of the matter at the moment. But the other thing is that I've been reading some interesting research lately where NATO has essentially disappeared from domestic reporting on the war. It's kind of, and they've been very kind of relaxed about Sweden and Finland entering NATO. You read the reporting around the Vilnius summit, very relaxed. Yeah, we knew this was going to happen, no big deal. So there's an interesting juxtaposition there between this kind of public international stance that NATO is the enemy, NATO is the driver, NATO is the bad guy, versus the kind of domestic treatment of NATO as ho-hum, this is no big deal. And so they're not whipping up NATO as a domestic security threat or a domestic threat in their context. And I find that very, very interesting. So I'm beginning to suspect that there may be an opportunity, again, after a long period of time and after Russia atones for its sins in Ukraine, there might be an opportunity for reopening some lines of communication between NATO and Russia. But that's a daring statement, I know. I just think that the way the domestic treatment of NATO is so kind of calm, they might be setting up that environment for the long distant future.
Well, that would certainly be a constructive step if it is true. So I certainly hope. We have a follow-up question here about the Balkans and whether this Ukrainian entry into the EU and potentially NATO could cause a Russian recalibration in the Western Balkans.
Well, I wonder, but Russia's becoming increasingly isolated in the Western Balkans. And I'm watching the behavior of people like President Vučić, for example, in Belgrade, Serbian president, who, has been very, very canny about balancing between NATO and Moscow. Certainly the years I was DSG at NATO, he was always very canny, permitting, for example, for us to do an emergency response exercise in Serbia in 2019 that went very, very well. So that was a close working relationship among NATO members and partners also in Serbia. Emergency response exercises, I think, are really good joint training, but also helpful in an era when we've got all these wildfires burning and big floods and big snowstorms, extremes of weather occurring. So emergency response cooperation is a good way to cooperate. So we saw that happening with Vučić. And then on the other hand, he goes off and buys MiG-29s from the Russians. So always, there was this balancing act going on. But in recent weeks, I'm seeing Vučić more, I would say, balanced or more tipping in the direction of NATO and Western West, perhaps one would say the political West, however you want to characterize that. So I'm wondering if, in the end of the day, Moscow is not becoming more isolated in its attempts to influence matters in the Balkans. But again, I wonder who asked that question. Oh, I guess we don't have the opportunity to let people speak. Is that right?
I think since we're in a webinar, we don't, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, anyway, that's a very good topic for discussion in a future seminar.
That'd be great. What I can do, however, is I have the names here of questions, and who's submitting them. So I can start reading the names. Which means, folks, if your question's already in, I have your name. If you would like to do it anonymously moving forward, please just note in your question that you wish for me not to call out your name, and I will simply withhold that information. But we do actually have a follow-up that I think, Rose, you may want to engage on this question of a better future relationship with Russia. So this question is from a Harrison McClintock. And he says, I like the idea of using this bad situation to pave the way to a better future relationship with Russia. He believes a great failure of the last century was the decline of relations between the US and USSR following FDR's death because of an arguably avoidable political blunder, is how he phrased that. This could be an excellent way to undo that mistake. How do you think Europe would respond to US attempts to bridge the gap with Russia by sending aid? And how should the United States handle that response?
Well, it's a great question, Harrison, but I don't actually believe that the emphasis should be on aid at this moment, or not even this. We're not talking about this moment, but as the war is concluding and as we're moving into a different phase, I don't think the emphasis should be on aid. All the damage that Putin has caused to the Russian economy has been self-inflicted. So I think it's up to the smart people in Russia to climb out of the deep economic hole they're in, and I think they're capable of doing that. There's still many talented people in Russia, both in the government, the central banking system, but also in the corporate sector who can help pull Russia out of this economic hole they're in. But I do think it's going to take a lot of political heavy lifting in the first instance, and I always emphasize that where we could I think make some early progress is returning to the nuclear agenda. Here is an existential threat that we all agree on. And I think the Russians are shooting themselves in the foot by suspending the implementation of the New START treaty, because it's in their interest, as the United States is modernizing its nuclear triad over the next decade and a half. It's in their interest to continue to keep the United States limited by a strategic arms reduction treaty. So they're shooting themselves in the foot. They don't recognize that right now. But I think I would hope for an early return to working on strategic arms control, nuclear arms control and limitation as one aspect of what we can do with the Russians to reestablish cooperation. And frankly, I think the NATO allies would support that very much, as well as our allies in Asia. The second thing, I think, which is a little more controversial, but I think it's equally urgent. Again, we're going through this incredible summer heat, wildfires, storms, tornadoes. It's clear that climate change is upon us now, and the Russians, with so much control of Arctic territory, we need to know what's going on in the Arctic in terms of climate change. And we've cut off all our scientist-to-scientist collaborations in Arctic and polar regions with the Russians. And I think I would see that as another existential threat. Let's say, okay, we're going to work with you on existential threats because they affect our survival as well as yours, and as well as the survival of people around the globe. So let's work together on nuclear challenges and on climate change. Those would be my two areas of starting up again with the Russians. Again, we'll see. I'm not so sure how the Europeans would react to that. I know many scientists would like to get back to cooperation because they see the urgency of us understanding what's happening with the ice shelves and with the tundra, the melting of the tundra as well.
Excellent. So I'd like to ask if you think that this kind of re-engagement might be possible with Putin himself still in power, or whether, as you're envisioning this is sort of a longer term question for perhaps a new Russian regime that we would be dealing with.
Well, again, this is my personal point of view, but I agree with the messages that have evidently gone between Washington and Moscow, that Washington is not seeking regime change. It's not what Washington should be about at this moment. So if Putin manages to stay on and comes through the end of the war, maybe he declares victory and says, I achieved my goals, even though it's evident that he did not, and his system allows him to stay on in the leadership, then I think we should be ready to work with him and with his government to do so. If, on the other hand, Putin leaves office for whatever reason, maybe he loses the presidential election. I don't think that's going to happen, but that's one possibility. Or we've seen the brittleness of the regime with Prigozhin's march on Moscow on June 24th. Maybe he leaves office given a safe path out to his Sochi palace by those surrounding him in the regime, and someone else steps forward to take over the presidency. I cannot tell, looking in from the outside, what may happen in that system, but I think we need to prepare for a future working with President Putin and working without President Putin, working with a successor.
Certainly. And I'd love to pick up another thread that you have raised, which is the nuclear threats that Putin has made and, what a responsible Western response looks like. You've rightly mentioned that Putin has also received pushback from China and from some of the Central Asian states for his nuclear threats in Ukraine, which is extraordinarily important. And I'd like to ask, what else you'd like to share in terms of your perspective on how NATO approaches that threat through this critical phase of the war where it's possible Putin will simply lose outright. And I know that the concept of a Russian loss makes a lot of people nervous that perhaps that will somehow erode our deterrence or cause Putin's decision-making calculus on the nuclear threat to change.
Yes, I think I still think it's a very small possibility of nuclear use, but we have to take into account the notion of, as we've called it, Putin locked in a corner with defeat, staring him in the face. And what does he do now? Does he take some desperate action in the hope of turning the Ukrainians away from their fight and ready to go to the negotiating table immediately? It would be a last-ditch attempt. There have been some in Moscow. I'm referring to an article about a month ago by Sergei Karaganov and another one by Dmitry Trainin, referring to nuclear Armageddon, that Russia's defeat in Ukraine means we're going to basically attack NATO with nuclear weapons and take the rest of you with us, take the whole world with them in a nuclear apocalypse, which I don't know where this crazy theme came from. It seems like it's the madman theory, taken to its greatest extent. I have been glad to see many experts in Moscow pushing back against that notion, as well as some responses in a more, I would say, stable vein coming out of the Russian government itself. So I don't really think that that's what we're talking about, but we could see Putin desperate, again, using one or several weapons to try to change the calculus of Ukraine and NATO, and to get Ukraine to come to the negotiating table. So I do think we have to leave that as a small possibility. And the way to continue to counteract that is to continue the strong messaging that has come, and not only from Washington and the NATO capitals, but from capitals like Beijing and New Delhi, that this would be simply a disaster and would really endanger nuclear war for all and must remain off the table. And then to take strong deterrence action as well. And the United States has been very clear that its nuclear forces remain ready if necessity calls. And I think those deterrence messages are very, very necessary as well.
Certainly. And I think it's important, therefore, to recognize that part of the requirement here is for the US and NATO to make whatever gain Putin thinks he could achieve in this very extreme circumstance where he decides to use a nuclear weapon, so limited, make those gains so limited in comparison to the cost that he would face that it simply becomes a non-starter. Thankfully, this is we regard this as a marginal risk to begin with, which can be made, even less likely if the United States and NATO continue to strengthen their deterrence in the way that they have thus far.
Right. Exactly.
Which is another way of saying we can't eliminate the threat entirely, right? All we can do is manage it to the smallest possible level. And fortunately, things do seem to be going in the right direction where that's concerned.
Right. I will just note that there's been, I would say, less of the nuclear saber rattling going on from officials recently, and that has been very, very welcome. This incident with Karaganov and Trainin putting their nuclear apocalypse vision out there was, I think, very different from what we are hearing at official levels.
Certainly. So we have a follow-up question here from a Harold Moss on the economic situation for Russia and continuing to prosecute the war. And the question is basically, do you think the declining Russian economic conditions and hyperinflation are going to impact Russia's abilities to continue a long-term conflict and to mobilize enough forces to sustain the war?
Well, there are a couple factors at work here. They are taking steps to prepare for further mobilization. Just yesterday, they raised the conscription age up to age 30, which I saw from reporting would mean that they have 1.5 million more men available. This is from age 27 to age 30. So they will have 1.5 million more men available for conscription. Also, though, in the reporting yesterday were comments that there seems to be a grave difference showing up in these parliamentary actions, very unusual, with some evident arguments between the Ministry of Defense and what their needs are, and some of the political leaders in the system. So worth watching whether they'll actually be able to implement this higher mobilization age. So that's one factor that's out there. Our experience of the Soviet era was that the top-heavy military expenditure eventually toppled the system. And that, I think, it conveys two messages. One, that the Soviets continued to spend on military no matter what kinds of economic problems it was making for the rest of the Soviet population. And I think that is pretty much at work now. No matter how many problems there are for the Russian population, they are continuing, the Russian leadership are continuing to pour money into defense and will continue to do so to prosecute this war. So I don't expect to see any diminution, in expenditures on the military just because the public is not getting, the same number of consumer goods, or the production is lagging in civilian sectors. So that's not the case, but I do think that a lot of the behind the scenes problems for the Russian economy are starting to drag on even military production. And I'll just refer to the fact it's harder and harder for them to get the modern components they need for their electronics and their advanced weaponry. They're not getting the chips they need. There's a lot of efforts, of course, to get around that in their trading, but nevertheless, they have to do a lot on the black market or the gray markets. And that's a very, very difficult way for them to have any predictability about their production rates. So a lot of factors weighing on them. I will say that I've been very much dependent and really used quite a bit Jeffrey Sonnenfeld's analyses from Yale. If people are interested in looking more into this, he's publishing regularly on the real picture of the Russian economy, not what we're seeing officially from the Russians. And I find his work to be very valuable.
That's great. So I do want to ask you about Belarus before we go, but we do first have a question following up on the Central Asian states. So I want to be sure to address the audience question first before my own. This is from a Devlin Burney, who's asking about some of the historic threats that Putin has leveled against Central Asia and how relevant, they still are to how these states calculate. So the example given is that Putin stated back in August 2014 that, quote, Kazakhs never had any statehood, and that the Kazakh president had created, quote, a state in a territory that had never had a state before. In response, Kazakhstan had threatened to withdraw from the Eurasian Economic Union, but these threats were never acted upon. And so the question is, do you believe that these comments still weigh on the minds of Kazakh policymakers even now?
Oh, I'm sure they do. It's funny, though, we've heard again recently, Putin repeating that there never was a Ukraine before, and that Ukrainians are not separate really from Russians, and they're all part of one big happy family. So I know the situation in Kazakhstan is different because of the different ethnic background, but that seems to be a favorite Putin talking point, I've got to say. And thank you, Devlin, for reminding me of that 2014 statement. I think it really stiffened the spines of the Kazakhs in terms of ensuring that the strength of their political and economic system was enough to withstand any onslaught by the Russians. And so they have increasingly been, I would say, expressing their independence in the way they have been conducting their economic and trading relationships, and also in the way they have been conducting themselves on the world stage. I mentioned the SCO, meaning the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting in November of 2022, where President Tokayev, and he's been very much that way since, really articulating a great, I would say, Kazakhstani independence in a way that one would not expect if they were in any way cowering from these Putin threats. So there is a certain level of self-confidence there, I think, that comes from the relationships they've established with the Chinese and with other trading partners. A European Union has been really active out in Central Asia. Frankly, when I was DSG at NATO, we had to shut down our Central Asia office. We just didn't have the personnel and resources to keep it open. But at that point, the European Union opened up a very active program and initiative in Central Asia, which I know has continued over time. So the Kazakhs have other options now, and so do the other countries in the region, and I think they will continue to develop those.
That's great. And I think you've continued to draw a very important distinction between questions of Putin's ideology and where that ideology leads him and his, opinions on things like statehood, which is one dynamic, of course. But then there's also the question of his capacity to achieve that and his ability to resource it and what that means for the freedom of action of some of these other leaders to chart their own way. So in terms of leaders with freedom of action, though, I want to turn to Belarus and ask you for your perspective on Putin's attempt to integrate Belarus into this new union state, and perhaps if you have any thoughts on the future of the Wagner Group as it moves to Belarus and whether that poses an increased threat to NATO.
Yes, we haven't talked about the African summit that's going on in Petersburg today, but Prigozhin did show up in Petersburg and he met with the president of the Central African Republic. So it seems like he's ensuring that his I'll put it this way, his business ties in West Africa and Central Africa are continuing. They are important in terms of his profit prospects. I know. So the other funny thing I saw from the reporting is that many of the African delegations are staying at the hotel that Prigozhin owns in St. Petersburg. So maybe that offers opportunities for interesting meetings in the bar as this summit is continuing to go forward. So back to your question about Belarus, though, Jennifer, I was just convinced that Lukashenko was completely in the embrace of Putin in recent times because of the way since 2 years ago and the Belarusian presidential election and the big demonstrations in Belarus, Lukashenko has turned increasingly to Putin to save him from the reform movement and the opposition in Belarus. And so he has been more and more willing to support Russia in every way he can, seemingly. But then it turns out that there is it seems a mutual dependence here, because on June 24th, it was Lukashenko who pulled the coals out of the fire as far as Putin was concerned. I don't know if I believe all the rumors that Putin flew off in panic out of Moscow because he didn't know exactly what to do, but it was Lukashenko, by his own account, who stepped forward and started talking to his old buddy, Yevgeny Prigozhin, and got him to stop his march on Moscow. So there's an interesting mutual dependency here that is continuing to play out because of the way the Wagner troops are now bivouacked, apparently, in Belarus. And we'll see where it goes from here. But I am wondering if it's not only a mutual dependency, but it's a mutual aid society in a way for these two men helping to keep each other in power.
Excellent. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for questions. So, Rose, I'd love to thank you myself and to welcome back Gabe, who I think has some final closing remarks here to wrap us up today.
Great. Well, let me just thank you, Jennifer, before we turn to Gabe, because it's been an excellent conversation and I've enjoyed it very, very much. So ask me back anytime.
Truly my pleasure.
Thank you so much, Bo. So on behalf of NSI, I'd like to thank you both so much, Jenny, and of course our amazing participant in our fireside chat, Ms. Rose Gottemoeller, and of course our audience for listening in and engaging in today's discussion. I think it can be said that we had a lot of good questions that stemmed, and we can be sitting here all afternoon talking about these wonderful issues. So thank you again. If you enjoyed this event, NSI has many more great events planned for the rest of 2023, and we're even doing some planning for 2024 early. So keep an eye on our website, which is www.nationalsecurity.gmu.edu. And also, if you want to hear more analysis more regularly from NSI experts, we have a podcast. Our flagship podcast is called Fault Lines, and it features Jamil Jaffer, our executive director, Jessica Jones, our deputy executive director, Lester Munson and Morgan Vigna, both senior fellows here at NSI, and they all get you quickly up to speed 3 times a week on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. 8 minutes at 12 o'clock Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and you'll be good to go for the rest of the day. So on that, I'm Gabriel Otis. Thank you so much again, both to our participants and our audience, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, all.